Finally, Matt Pottinger joins us. Matt has been claimed by David Ignatius, many others, many of us who know him. We think he's one of the finest fellow Americans we've ever known. He helped advance China policy, elevated this issue. He speaks fluent Mandarin, so as a policymaker, he was able to directly interface with the ambassador to Washington from Beijing, as well as other figures in the Chinese Communist Party. He's just filled his role as first being the head of the China desk for the National Security Council, and then was promoted to probably one of the toughest jobs on the face of the earth, the Deputy National Security Advisor. I'm pleased to announce today that he is, as of yesterday, become a senior visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And our world's a better place for having him. Matt Pottinger, thank you for joining us in your first public presentation or interview since you left the White House. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to start with Matt, since you are coming right out of the gate here. And I wanted to get your take on President Biden calls you up and says, Matt, we're looking at making some changes. This job's a little more complicated than I thought. I think I'd better speak to you one-on-one. What would you say to President Biden when he said, what are the things we should keep that you did? And what are the things that maybe are things where, on hindsight, like all of us make on hindsight, with 2020 hindsight, that you might not do or course correct?
Andrew, thanks a lot for having me. And it's great to be with this panel of just really accomplished reporters. Nathan, it's great to see you as well. And congrats on graduating from Yale Law. I know you're going to put that education to good use, trying to fight for the return of rule of law in Hong Kong, which has sadly been grievously undermined by Beijing. So, yeah, you know, I think that, you know, were I to be giving advice, which I don't presume to do for the new team that's come in, one of the first things I would say is don't fall into a negotiation trap. You know, one of the things that we were very careful to avoid doing, and there was a lot of back and forth in 2017 in the first year of the Trump administration, but ultimately we decided that it was to the advantage of the United States not to let China draw out the clock, but for the United States to press the clock by imposing costs on the things that China's doing that have been undermining systematically our prosperity, our national security, our democratic way of life. So don't fall for a trap that Beijing sets time and again for administration after administration, which is to try to lure the United States into a long, formal, mid-level, bottoms-up negotiation. And they usually give it fancy names like strategic and economic dialogue, or the economic and strategic dialogue, and so forth. And in 2017, our trade ambassador, Bob Lighthizer, showed a chart to the president and to the whole cabinet that showed all of these various dialogues that we've gotten trapped in over the course of 2 decades, and how the U.S. trade deficit and our hemorrhaging of intellectual property only continued to go up this escalator. It got worse and worse with each successive administration, each successive formal dialogue. So we should be talking on our terms, and we should be speaking with actions. But they have an experienced team that's come in, and I'm hopeful that they do review, as I know they have, closely review the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, our national security strategy, all of the implementation plans, many of which remain classified, but which support, and which they now have in their hands, support implementation of a strategy that I think there is a bipartisan consensus for in the United States, and increasing support for among allies and partners around the world as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Politburo member Yang last night described Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang as issues concerning, quote, China's core interests in which the U.S. should stop interfering, end quote. Quote, they constitute a red line that must not be crossed, end quote. The Politburo member added, quote, any trespassing would end up undermining U.S.-China relations and the United States' own interests, end quote. How are we supposed to reconcile that, Matt, with genocide?
Yeah, well, it may be irreconcilable. You have a determination made by the Secretary of State who just left, Mike Pompeo, that a genocide is being perpetrated right now in China. Not cultural genocide only, genocide. Okay, and the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has made clear that that is also the view of the Biden administration. So you have a consensus of view. The business community as a whole in the United States needs to come to terms with the fact that a genocide is occurring right now in China. They need to come to terms with the fact that over the last 4 years, we've worked very hard. At the beginning, worked in very good faith to try to achieve a results-oriented and constructive relationship with Beijing. But it takes two to tango. Beijing is, its actions do not support the idea of greater cooperation, a warmer relationship, a more cooperative relationship with the United States and the rest of the free world, or even its close neighbors. I mean, you look at what has happened to Hong Kong, you look at the threats against Taiwan, you look at the fact that they've attacked India and are still trying to press their advantage in sort of a senseless border campaign by Beijing. So the business community in the United States needs to begin to really grapple with the reputational risks that are rapidly rising if they want to continue doing business in China, if they want to expand or invest in China. They're going to have to reckon with a broad-based grassroots consensus, as well as a consensus among the Trump administration, the Biden administration, about the worst crimes of humanity that are currently taking place there.
Great, thank you. Two more quick questions for Matt, and then we're going to move on to the rest of the panelists. This one's important for our, I think this one's a core issue. Did the Chinese Communist Party take out bounties to kill U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan? That's been floating around in the Indian media in several different places. Did that happen?
Yeah, so I'd want to be careful talking about any intelligence that we've received. I've noticed those reports that you're talking about that came out of Afghan media, as well as out of the Indian media. I think it's a question that that the press should be asking Beijing in light of some of the information that came out late last year. But I don't want to go into U.S. assessments and intelligence. I think it's unclear, but that there's a question that's still hanging right now about whether that took place.
Okay, I'd like to, the final question on this directly to you is, you have an interesting family background as it pertains to infectious diseases. I believe you have a brother who's a doctor at the University of Washington where COVID hit early. You have a wife who's a doctor in infectious diseases. With the COVID situation, what can you talk about in terms of how things started? Is there anything you can add to the narrative right now regarding COVID, or what's your view just overall on COVID and how that all came down?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning my family. My wife is a virologist. She's a PhD. She worked for many years in the labs at the Centers for Disease Control. She's Vietnamese-born, U.S. trained and raised virologist who's been really helpful to me in my understanding of the crisis that we've been in for now a full year. At the end of the administration, the end of the Trump administration, the State Department put out two statements, a statement by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as a fact sheet. That fact sheet, probably because we were all distracted, it didn't get a tremendous amount of attention from the press, but I wanted to emphasize that fact sheet is a pretty good encapsulation of what we know about the origins and what we don't know about the origins of COVID. It's important to know that that was a very carefully vetted fact sheet. That fact sheet was vetted by our colleagues across the U.S. government, Health and Human Services, throughout the State Department, the White House, as well as our intelligence leadership. So it was carefully crafted so as not to overstate the case on the origins. But I think it's really important for people to revisit that and take a look. There are new facts that have been unearthed about the role of the Chinese military in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That is a sort of a parallel body of activity that was taking place in those labs that was not previously disclosed by China. There was the disclosure as well in that fact sheet of an outbreak of flu-like illness inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology in November, right when people think that this virus began to take off. It doesn't mean that was COVID, but it raises questions about assertions that Chinese officials have made about how no one faced any illness. So, I'd refer you to some of the debate. I thought New York Magazine did a pretty good job with their overview of some of the dangers of gain-of-function research. But we may never know, for as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power, exactly how this thing originated. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay. One last question. There's a scourge that's gone across America that's killed hundreds of thousands of Americans that has roots in China, deep roots in China, that's not called COVID. It's called fentanyl, which has been mixed into street drugs throughout the United States. The president's hometown of Philadelphia, or near Wilmington, Philadelphia, has been an epicenter of some of the most serious recent overdoses. And with COVID here, overdoses are a really serious problem throughout the United States. It's quietly going unnoticed. In fairness to the Chinese Communist Party, 1.4 billion, 1.5 billion people is a lot of people. Are they complicit in the fentanyl trade? Is that being done purposely? Are they, or not? Or are they doing enough to shut it down? Matt.
Yeah, so in 2018, President Trump secured a personal commitment from General Secretary Xi Jinping to begin classifying fentanyl analogs. There are all these synthetic analogs that are invented in labs, but to take that whole category of poison, which is what it is, and make it classify it as controlled substances. So the Chinese leader made good on that promise. It did lead to, according to our Drug Enforcement Agency colleagues, it did lead to a decline in the amount of fentanyl that was coming directly to the United States through the mail to American communities across the country. What has happened in the wake of that has been a shift of the production of this poison to Mexico and other countries by sending precursor chemicals from the same Chinese state-owned enterprises that were originally making this stuff, this poison, and sending it to the United States. Those same enterprises are now sending precursor chemicals or in some cases completed synthetic analogs for fentanyl to third countries, and then it still finds its way into the United States. So we've got a serious problem, and it's a problem that has to be tackled on the demand side as well as on the supply side. There's definitely more that China can be doing. It knows that there's more than it could be doing to clamp down. They have significant control over all business activity that takes place inside their borders, and so that's something that we should be shaming them about and pressing for more help. You mentioned, just the state of this outbreak in Philadelphia. You had, just in the first 9 months of 2020, you had almost 1,000 deaths from overdoses. The vast majority of them from fentanyl. The fentanyl think about that for a minute. I mean, okay, that's in one city, Philadelphia, 1,000 dead in just 9 months, which is the worst year for overdoses in the history of that city by far. This fentanyl is getting into more than just heroin or what's being peddled as heroin. It's getting into synthetic cannabis. It's getting into what look like prescription pills. It's getting into methamphetamine. So it's everywhere. This stuff, just minute quantities of this stuff. 1 grain of this stuff is enough to kill quite a number of people. So the American public needs to understand just how this threat is actually continuing to rise, even though we've had some victories in battles in fighting that supply over the course of President Trump's tenure. Thanks.
So I'd like to move on to the next piece of it, Edward, and I kind of would like to open the floor on this one. We've dealt with some issues of what the problems are, but I don't believe in illuminating issues and problems without proposing solutions. Over the years, it's been commonplace for countries that are struggling, even East Germany, back when they were in another era in their history. When two countries are struggling, one thing they can do to kind of get things started, to feel each other out, are prisoner swaps. And the CFO of Huawei has been in custody, I'll use that term loosely, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on a US warrant. She was on her way to Mexico 2 years ago in December and was stopped at the Vancouver airport. And this has created a big issue for Canada, China, and also the United States, as there's a huge extradition battle to get her out. She's accused of sharing technology, a lot of different things I won't get into. She's also the daughter of one of the most famous founding technologists in Chinese history and a former Chinese army general, Ren. So Ms. Meng is up in Vancouver and the Chinese government wants her released. So do you think a prisoner swap would work for Michael Koenig and Michael Spavor, who've both been in very, very serious, they haven't been walking around Vancouver or Beijing with ankle bracelets going to nice luncheons. They've been in confinement in a jail cell for 2 years, unlike Ms. Meng. But what are called Canada's two Mikes, Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow, and the HK-12, a prisoner swap. Edward, what do you think? Isn't it a show me world? What, if they really want red lines not crossed, don't they owe it to the United States? And can't the U.S. do something with a prisoner swap to get some people repositioned where they should be?
Yeah, I think there's two different parts of your question, which is one is whether a prisoner swap, as you put it, would work, and the other is whether the U.S. should engage in something like that. I think those are two separate things. Correct. And on the first one, I think it would work because I think that obviously China has engaged in some form of hostage diplomacy with the two Michaels, for example. I don't think anyone here would question the fact that both Michael Kovrig, whom I met when I was working in Beijing, as well as Michael Spavor, were imprisoned and charged, brought up on trial on national security charges because Canada had arrested Meng Wanzhou at the request of the U.S. Justice Department. So I do think the entire reason why China took the two Michaels is in order to try and do some sort of swap. Now, it's a lot more complicated whether the U.S. should engage in something like that. Obviously, policymakers do talk about prisoner swaps in certain contexts. For example, in the Afghan peace talks, there have been discussions of prisoner swaps, and the U.S. has endorsed that. But here, I remember when Meng was arrested, there was a lot of talk about politicizing what is a DOJ process. And I think, someone like Matt can obviously talk in more detail about this, but there's a lot of discussion about whether Trump was mixing up trade talk policy with the potential for, giving some leniency to Meng Wanzhou, mixing up various strands of China policy with demands that China was making. And I think China has always been very good at this. Like, it's been in their negotiations, they try and link disparate issues and try and get the U.S. to act in China's interests in order to get something back. And here, your question asks, one, whether the U.S. should, review its principles about how the DOJ operates and rule of law in order to engage in this prisoner swap to get the Canadians out. And not just the Canadians, but the Hong Kong prisoners, Joshua and Agnes, whom, many people feel should not be spending any time in prison at all, and are under potential threat there. And U.S. policy in Hong Kong is a totally separate issue, or should, in theory, remain separate from this DOJ prosecution case against Meng Wanzhou, which is a case based on a violation of sanctions against Iran by Huawei and a satellite company that Huawei was running. And Meng was apparently engaged in deception, deceiving non-Chinese companies about Huawei's role in those sanctions violations. So there's pretty thorny questions, I think, about mixing up strands of policy here, as well as the question of whether you're encouraging more hostage diplomacy from China if you decide to make this swap. And I'd be curious, what other people here think. But I think those are just laying out why it's not so easy to push ahead with that. I do think that if the U.S. does engage in negotiations over that, it would work. It would probably work, but I'm not sure if it would get all of the people you named out. But at the very least, they would release the two Michaels probably in exchange for Meng, because
that's not a good enough deal, Edward. Joshua's getting freed. Matt Pottinger, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I agree with much of what Ed just said, including the fact that China is engaging in hostage diplomacy right now. There's no one questions the reason why Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are sitting under difficult, hard conditions right now in Chinese prisons. They're hostages. They're human bargaining chips, and it speaks volumes about the nature of the regime that the world is grappling with right now in Beijing. I think that the Department of Justice actually does have quite a bit of leeway and the ability to get creative in cutting deals, so long as they're the wrongs of Huawei are in some manner addressed by Huawei and the Chinese government. If you look at some of the complaints, the Department of Justice complaints against Huawei, they've been prosecuted under RICO statutes. So they're basically have been designated as a criminal enterprise by the Department of Justice. And so I think that Huawei is going to have to make some kind of a concession and admission of wrongdoing. But obviously, the two Michaels need to be released. I have every confidence that they would be part of any kind of a settlement that could possibly occur between the Department of Justice and Huawei, and of course the Hong Kong 12 or 11, one who's gone home.
Yep.
Are no one doubts that they are being politically persecuted right now, and that they need to be released, whether that's part of a settlement over Huawei or some other gambit. They and others, including Joshua and Agnes, need to be set free.
Correct. A quick question for Matt. So CIC is called the China Investment Corporation, is a sovereign wealth fund of $1 trillion that invests in every major private equity firm in America. Every private equity firm then buys American corporations. They co-invest with pension funds of firefighters, U.S. firefighters, nurses, teachers, police officers, people that are just common good folks. And you don't, do those pension funds realize when it goes to Larry Fink, for example, in New York, or it goes to Fidelity in Boston, don't they have responsibility, to Josh's point, to stop this action and to allow for full disclosure amongst private equity and other things that CIC is your pension fund's co-investing with a sovereign wealth fund that's running concentration camps, Matt?
Yeah, so the Chinese Communist Party has been very skillful in exploiting a significant shift in the way that the investment industry works. The shift has been away from active, careful investment, considered investment by active portfolio managers, and toward passive investment. And that passive investment, the big money now, probably the majority of money that's being invested around the world, is through these passive funds that put their money into indexes. And those indices are controlled by companies, some that you may named, Barclays and MSCI and others. Mm-hmm. And so what the Chinese government realized was, if they wanted to tap that passive money, that is the money of everyday Americans, pensioners, retired federal officials, sailors, airmen, Marines, firefighters, teachers, what they needed to do was to get Chinese Communist Party controlled companies, state-owned companies, onto those indexes. And then the money would just sort of automatically, by hundreds of billions of dollars, pour into those state-owned firms, even though many of those firms are not audited according to the same standards that American companies and other foreign companies have to be audited. So the Chinese government pressured those indexes to weight Chinese state-owned companies more heavily. And over time, those indices capitulated, put them on there. So most Americans don't even know that they are funding the same companies that are working to dominate the U.S. technologically or to dominate us militarily. So you have this perverse situation where U.S. Marines and soldiers, their pension dollars were about to be diverted into Chinese military companies that they would be fighting in the event of a war. So the first step that we took to address this was last year, in the first part of last year. The National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, and the National Economic Counselor, Larry Kudlow, wrote a joint letter to the board of the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, which is the big pension fund for U.S. federal officials and our military, and said, you must cease and desist from tying all of this pension money from federal employees to these indices, including the MSCI World Index, that suddenly are weighting Chinese companies more heavily. That led to a symbolic victory by the administration, and really on behalf of all pension holders in the United States. That board decided to refrain, or at least for now, refrain from investing in those Chinese companies. The second step that we took was even more consequential, and that was to President Trump in November, and then also in January, put out a pair of executive orders that said companies that appear on a Department of Defense blacklist, if you will, a list that basically names countries that are, quote unquote, Chinese communist military companies. That is, companies that are controlled or owned or affiliated with China's military modernization. The Pentagon now keeps a list of those companies. What President Trump did was, he said, U.S. persons are no longer allowed to invest in those companies or in their subsidiaries, as defined by the Treasury Department. So that has meant that many of these index funds are now wondering, are they going to have to drop these Chinese companies from their indices? The short answer is absolutely they're going to have to do that, so long as President Biden doesn't deliberately reverse those executive orders and make an affirmative decision to channel more passive, hundreds of billions of passive dollars back into those Chinese military those are two significant steps that were taken that I hope the new administration will persist with.
Pottinger, question for you. Is that a good idea, A? And B, if they were, in the event of an attack, of a Beijing attack on Taiwan, by treaty, Congress has to consult with the president, unlike Japan, for example, where we by treaty would go defend them. What's your take on that? There's always the morning after something like that occurs. Is that a risky move you'd hold from right now? Or do you think we should support democracy and sunlight's the best disinfectant and she should come to Washington?
Yeah, I think that substantive actions that will help Taiwan deter a conflict, deter China from indulging the temptation to try to coercively annex Taiwan, are the sorts of things that we and other nations around the world should be focused on. Substantive rather than symbolic. Mm-hmm. Senator Risch at the opening made that videotaped remark. I thought it was very good. He laid out what's at stake if Taiwan is coercively pressed into unification with China, if it's forcibly annexed. What that means for the United States is quite grave. It means the extinguishing of the first ever Chinese democracy, and an extremely prosperous and successful one. It means that the U.S. Risks, on the one hand, war with China, or if the U.S. were to capitulate, it would mean the undermining of our credibility with other key allies around the region. It has enormous implications for the semiconductor industry and for electronic supply chains in ways that could seriously undermine U.S. competitiveness and our innovation edge. It could lead to war with Japan and China, maybe even India and China. So in other words, this is a genie we want to keep in the bottle. Mm-hmm. And the things that the United States should be doing should be, I'm one who favors substance over symbolism, but agree that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this side. The people of Taiwan need to understand how significant and dangerous the situation's getting, and that's no fault of their leadership. That is all about Beijing and its appetites and ambitions. But the people of Taiwan need to really rally around their leadership and understand that they're going to have to make sacrifices. There are things that they're going to have to do to prepare for war in order to hopefully deter war.
Thank you. I'd like to wrap this up, but I'm going to tell you one story, one Matt Pottinger story that I meant to share earlier. He contacted me about some COVID related things domestic to the United States to try to help out. That came about 5:30 in the morning one morning. And then at 10 o'clock one night, I tried to reach out to him. And it was all this aviation noise around at 10 o'clock at night. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And he said, could I get you an answer in the morning? And I said, by the way, where the hell are you right now? It was 10 o'clock at night after starting at 5 a.m. And our fellow American here, Mr. Pottinger, was getting on a helicopter to go to Dover Air Force Base with the Commandant of the Marine Corps to receive a fallen soldier from Iraq. I got my answer at 5:15 the next morning. So your service to our country is without question, and it's a real honor to see you on the other side of it, and free to have a life for yourself. So thank you for your service, Matt.